So I'm going to give a quick introduction to a few things you probably already know. I'm sure that you have all heard about the various risks associated with hydrofracking for shale gas. I'm going to list them here. Water contamination, including contamination of groundwater, aquifers, and private wells. Air pollution involving carcinogens and other toxic chemicals. Sick and dying animals, including wildlife and livestock. Wildlife in Wyoming has been found to have disappeared near drilling. Cattle in Pennsylvania has been quarantined after drinking brine from the wastewater. There are human health impacts. The chemicals involved can cause cancer, brain damage, birth defects, neurological problems, and respiratory problems. And many of them, such as birth defects and endocrine problems, may not surface for many years. I really recommend that you look at the extensive work done by Dr. Theo Colborn on exactly this topic, health impacts. Another risk is the creation of an industrial landscape in place of our tranquil, rural, beautiful, peaceful area in upstate New York. Tony Ingraffia, who I'm sure you've probably all heard speak, he shows that if we allow the Marcellus shale play in New York, there may be as many as 8 wells per square mile over 70% of the Marcellus region. I assume that you're all aware that since 2005, hydrofracking has been exempt from the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Water Act, as well as other federal acts that are intended to protect the environment. I'm sure you've also heard the industry state repeatedly that this type of drilling is safe. They have even repeatedly stated that there have been no cases of water contamination. This is absolutely not true. A report by Riverkeeper cites more than 100 cases across the country where federal and state regulators identified gas drilling operations as the known or suspected cause of groundwater, drinking water, and surface water contamination. In Pennsylvania, state regulators have found contaminated drinking water, polluted surface waters, polluted air, and contaminated soils. The Monongahela River and the Susquehanna River have both been affected. And I'm sure you've read the reports of the spills and the blowouts in Pennsylvania. I know that upstate New York, and particularly the area on top of the Marcellus Shale, has been struggling economically for quite some time. I'm the first one to want to help our struggling farmers and anybody else who's struggling. Please believe that. I want to help them. I just do not believe that this is the way to go. In reality, New York State may be worse off economically in the long run if we allow shale gas drilling to come. Is the potential economic gain worth the risks? I've reviewed the frequently quoted economic impact studies, and I'll explain why the conclusions are likely to be exaggerated. First, a warning. I'm sure you've all heard the numbers like 150 or 200 or even 400 jobs per well created. When you hear such numbers quoted, remember that gas workers move from well to well, so these jobs are not measured in person years. Many of the jobs are short-term and part-time, and many of these workers are imported from other states on a transient, non-permanent basis. Whenever you hear such numbers quoted, be sure to look at the numbers carefully, seek out the sources, and evaluate the bias of the sources of the numbers. Also note that when you hear claims of many jobs being created, remember that the oil and gas industry is 10 times more capital intensive than the average industry. So perhaps it would be better for our regional economy, and in particular for job creation, to encourage a more labor-intensive type of industry. I've included this slide just to give you an idea of jobs that can be created from renewable energy as opposed to oil and gas drilling. The University of Massachusetts concluded that renewables, while still relatively capital intensive compared to other industries, they still create more jobs than the oil and gas industry per dollar expended. So the economic impact studies. The studies that I've read, and I think I've seen all of them, that claim a positive economic impact tend to be either biased, dated, seriously flawed, or simply inapplicable to our region. The studies not funded by the gas companies have reached vastly different conclusions than those funded by the gas companies. The studies I've reviewed come from 5 regions. In New York, I looked at the Draft Supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Study, the SGEIS, and I looked at the Broome County study. In Pennsylvania, I looked at 2 studies out of Penn State, and a third one that was funded by the American Petroleum Institute. Also, in the Marcellus Shale, there was a study of West Virginia. In the Fayetteville Shale in Arkansas, there were 2 studies out of the business school, both funded by Southwestern Energy. In Texas, I looked at the Perryman study. And finally, I looked at a study of Western states by a firm called Headwaters Economics. And there's another academic study that I'll mention when I get there. First, the SGEIS. It was released by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the DEC, in 2009. The economic analysis in the SGEIS is from 1988. Yes, 1988. It's 22 years old. No responsible decision maker should rely on an economic analysis that is 22 years old. Too many things change. The SGEIS ignores the possible declines in other industries that may result from both pollution and a shift to an industrial landscape. These industries include agriculture, tourism, organic farming, winemaking, hunting, fishing, and river recreation. A thorough evaluation would include impact analysis of potential declines in all the other industries. The SGEIS also ignores other significant costs. For example, it recommends that 150 new tasks be assigned to the DEC, but the cost of staffing these additional tasks are not reflected in the analysis. And by the way, the DEC has been laying people off. The SGEIS itself references several other flawed studies, one of which is the Broome County study. The Broome County study was commissioned by the Broome County Legislature. This study ignores declines in other industries also. Again, industries like tourism, agriculture, organic farming, sport hunting, fishing, etc. A major food cooperative in New York City that purchases millions of dollars of New York State-produced agricultural products has stated, and I quote, "Our members will not want the fruit and veggies that come from farms in an industrialized area, and they are concerned about whether the cows they buy were drinking contaminated water and breathing the air fouled by enormous trucks that will support the hydrofracking process and also by the hydrofracking process itself." So it's going to be tougher to sell agricultural products to these major purchasers in New York City. The Broome County study ignores very relevant and very significant costs. There'll be damage to infrastructure, especially roads and bridges. I understand that a minimum of 1,000 large truck trips are required per well. Be skeptical of the claims made by the gas industry that they will pay for road damage. The tiny town, very tiny town of Cochecton in Sullivan County, New York, suffered between $1 and $1.2 million worth of damage to roads due to the construction of the Millennium Pipeline. The pipeline company said they would pay. The pipeline company in reality ended up paying only $125,000. The town was stuck for the rest. Speaking of road damage, it's recently come to my attention that the Fayetteville Shale region in Arkansas, where I note there is a severance tax, the Arkansas Highway Department said that the gas industry has caused $455 million worth of damage to highways. Highways, that's state highways. That doesn't include county roads or city roads. So the full road damage would be much more. Anyway, Arkansas added a percentage to their severance tax specifically to help pay for the road damage. But in 1.5 years, they only collected $36 million. So the taxpayers of Arkansas will have to make up the difference, which is more than $400 million. Back to the Broome County study. The costs of drinking water contamination and land, stream, and air pollution are ignored in the Broome County study. The cost of mitigation is ignored, and so is the cost in terms of health. Again, various contaminants in the fracking fluid and the flowback fluids are endocrine disruptors and carcinogens. The economic costs of treating birth defects and serious diseases are not reflected in this study or in any of the economic impact studies. Also, this study ignores declines in property values. Supporters of gas drilling say that property values will increase. Here's a major unanswered question. Rental rates will probably increase, and we have seen that happen in Pennsylvania. The value of large tracts of land may increase. but single-family homes and small lots will probably decline in value. Reports indicate that some banks are not giving mortgages for properties with a gas lease or even for properties nearby leased land. And how do you sell a house if your buyer can't get a mortgage or if it has contaminated drinking water? Also, some insurance companies are refusing to issue policies on homes with gas wells. It was reported that the Wise County Central Real Estate Appraisal District, Wise County is in the Barnett Shale in Texas. They decreased values of homes by 75% when a gas well sits on the land. Let's look at the economic reality in New York. While I'm, again, the first to admit that there are many factors that may distinguish one county from another, I decided to take a look at some measures of economic health in gas-intensive New York State counties. I looked at actual data for the top 10 gas-producing counties in New York State. This is, of course, conventional vertical drilling. I admit the results might be different with more intense drilling and hydrofracking, but we can learn from this. I looked at the period from 2006 to 2008, and I compared the top 10 gas-producing counties to 5 neighboring counties without gas wells. The gas-intensive counties are not better off than the non-gas drilling counties. The gas-intensive counties are not better off when you look at the number of families below poverty level, the median household income, or unemployment rates. And by the way, I'm not the only person saying this. More recently, a Cornell professor, Dr. Susan Christopherson, did this comparison for both New York counties and for Pennsylvania counties, and she reached the exact same conclusion. Let's move on to Pennsylvania. I'm grouping 3 studies together here. They have the same primary author, Tim Considine. The first 2 came out of Penn State, where he worked at the time, and they were both funded by the Marcellus Shale Coalition, a coalition of gas companies. The third study was funded by the API, the American Petroleum Institute, another trade association. The author had moved from Penn State to the University of Wyoming before the third study came out, but it is the same author on all 3 studies. All 3 of these studies are likely biased because they're funded by the industry and the industry provided all of the data. It appears that the industry has been exaggerating its estimates of gas production expected from shale. Arthur Berman, a petroleum geologist and financial consultant to the energy sector, has shown that the decline curves for gas extraction in the Barnett Shale and the Fayetteville Shale are much steeper than industry claims. This basically means that the vast majority of the gas is produced in the first 1 or 2 years of the well's existence. So the years of production per well are fewer in reality than what is assumed in the economic impact studies. Deborah Rogers, a financial expert and a former member of the advisory committee for the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, states that based on historical production data, the average Barnett Shale well life is 7.5 years, not the 30 to 40 years as originally projected. Rogers says that reserves may be overestimated by a substantial factor, possibly as high as 300%. And she says the gas companies may have borrowed a huge amount of money based on reserves that they cannot pull out of the ground at a commercially viable cost. Rogers says that some analysts have gone so far as to liken this to the mortgage-backed securities bubble. So if assumptions of the levels of gas production and the number of years of production are overly exaggerated, and these overly exaggerated numbers are put into an economic model, then it's pretty obvious that projections that come out of the model, such as employment levels, income levels, and tax revenues, will also be overly exaggerated. And that's exactly what's happened in all of these studies. Again, like the studies I mentioned before, the Penn State studies and the API study ignore important economic costs such as infrastructure damage, water contamination, and other pollution, and declines in other industries. The studies all take a short-term view. I ask what happens to the region when all the gas is gone and we may be left with contaminated drinking water, pollution, an industrial landscape, and a population with failing health. Note that all of the flaws that I mentioned in the Pennsylvania studies also apply to the Arkansas Fayetteville study because they copied the approach. The more recent West Virginia study also shares some of these flaws in that they use the same technique, input-output analysis, and they base their data on a survey of the gas companies. I do give them credit for at least listing some of the things that are not reflected in their analysis, both positive and negative, and they even mention the serious environmental risks. The West Virginia study also confirms that the natural gas industry is known for hiring out-of-state workers. The other studies didn't admit that. All right, I mentioned input-output analysis a second ago, also called I/O analysis. It's the technique that's used for most of these economic impact studies. There are a number of reasons why this is not a good standalone technique to use for estimating the economic impact of drilling. I don't really have time to go over them all tonight, but if any of you are interested in this, please contact me. I'll be giving you my email at the end. Economic reality in Pennsylvania. Many gas industry workers in Pennsylvania are from out of state. Some reports say as many as 70%. More recently, I've seen reports that say 30%. I believe that new 30% figure is based on a recent survey of drilling companies in Pennsylvania. You don't think they'd be likely to stretch the truth, do you? Industry claims that they're committed to hiring local workers. An Oklahoma paper reported that many gas companies are using dormitory-style housing because, quote, most workers are from outside the area, spending 2 weeks on the job and 2 weeks off. Now, we all know that Chesapeake Energy has recently built exactly this type of housing in the Marcellus region in Pennsylvania. Maybe we'll hear more about that. So I ask, why are they building these if they're truly committed to training and hiring local residents? The Marcellus Shale Coalition, a lobbying organization for the gas industry, still quotes the Penn State study and claims that 88,000 new jobs have been created in Pennsylvania in 2010 due to Marcellus shale drilling. They said 88,000. Remember that number. Publicly available, unbiased Pennsylvania state data show that total job creation in the state was only 65,600. And half of those jobs were in education and health, or leisure and hospitality, not gas drilling. The grandiose job claims are from data provided by the industry, and they're not at all consistent with data from unbiased, publicly available sources. I visited Bradford County recently. I spoke with various people, and I toured the area to see a bunch of the gas drilling sites. I was told by a county commissioner that Bradford County was advised by a team of academic sociologists that 80% of communities with gas drilling are worse off in the long run. Bradford County wants to be one of the 20%. Who doesn't? But it takes careful planning and proper regulation and policy making. And in Pennsylvania, specifically Bradford County, it would require significantly slowing down the pace and extent of drilling. I was told that people in Bradford County feel that their community is being treated as a throwaway community. Yes, they use that term, a throwaway community, for the benefit of the oil and gas industry. I don't want that for our communities in New York State. Let's move on to Texas. Supporters of natural gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale often point to the success of the Barnett Shale play. There's only one economic impact study of the Barnett Shale that's frequently quoted. It's called the Perryman study, done by the Perryman Group consulting firm. I've been developing economic models for a very long time, and I would never submit a report without clearly stating my data sources, describing my model structure, and showing tests of model accuracy. The Perryman study fails on all three of these. It doesn't make clear where the data come from, and it claims that their econometric model is proprietary, like those fracking fluids. I simply cannot trust this study until more information is provided. But even if Texas has experienced a significant positive economic impact, it doesn't mean that New York State will. Comparing the economic impact of gas drilling in the Barnett Shale to gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale is like comparing apples to oranges. The labor force in Texas has the requisite skill set due to its long history of oil and gas drilling there. Rural counties in upstate New York have to import much of this labor, We saw that Pennsylvania has imported probably 70% of the gas drilling labor force. The imported labor is often temporary and transient, sending most of their income back home to their families to spend there, often Texas. Texas has a huge support industry network for the oil and gas industry activities. It has all the requisite machinery and equipment, much of which is distributed, contracted for, repaired, and serviced in Texas. New York State doesn't have gas company headquarters. They tend to be headquartered in other states, like Oklahoma and, again, Texas. And the Barnett Shale is in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, a dynamic urban region with all the affected industries ensconced right there. This is very different from rural New York. The Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex may be a good place to use input-output analysis. If all the industries are there and they've been there for a long time, we would know the input-output coefficients and their structures. Also, Texas has a warm climate, so as landowners become rich, they're likely to stay there. Who knows what will happen to landowners in New York after they become rich? We don't know. They may move, they may stay. We don't really know how people spend their windfalls. So Texas may derive a greater economic benefit from gas drilling in New York than will New York. And it's kind of amusing because once when I gave a similar talk and I made this statement, there were a bunch of people from Texas in the audience, including Mayor Tillman. And they stood up and they said, but wait a minute, you make it sound like Texas is doing well financially due to gas drilling. We're definitely not. So that was kind of interesting. Economic multipliers. They're frequently mentioned, and so I want to make sure you're aware of some generally known facts about multipliers. They are larger in more developed areas with industrial diversity. This is certainly true of the Fort Worth area, not true of the Catskills or the rest of rural New York. Multipliers are larger for areas with a labor force that has the requisite skills. Again, that's true of Fort Worth, but not rural New York. Multipliers are larger in areas where permanent residents are the workers. True in Fort Worth, maybe not in the Marcellus region of upstate New York. And finally, multipliers are larger for labor-intensive industries than for capital-intensive industries. Early on, I said that the oil and gas industry is 10 times more capital-intensive than the average industry. So it's very unlikely to have a large multiplier. A nonprofit firm out west, Headwaters Economics, did a very informative study that was not funded by the gas companies. It analyzed 23 counties out west to compare the economic health of counties that focused on fossil fuel extraction as an economic development strategy to neighboring counties that did not. It concluded that the counties that were not focused on fossil fuel extraction experienced higher growth rates, more diverse economies, better educated populations, a smaller gap between high and low income households, and more retirement and investment income. While I'm on the subject of impact in Western states, there have been some knowledgeable people also speaking about community impacts. For example, Jill Morrison of the Powder River Basin Resource Council in Wyoming reported that there has been a 10% to 15% increase in the crime rate in the counties in Wyoming where there have been gas booms. She also said that they had terrible drug problems, particularly with methamphetamines coming into the counties with the gas booms. These counties have had to increase the size of their jails, and these are additional costs to communities that are not reflected in any of these economic impact studies. I can give you a source for some of her information if you want to contact me. Closer to home in Pennsylvania, in August of 2010, the Penn State Cooperative Extension quoted Bradford County Commissioner Mark Smith in a document. He said, "The things people don't understand are the impacts on volunteer fire departments, social services, drug and alcohol prevention, jails, and state police." He said that 60 to 70 out-of-state gas drilling workers had gone through his county's jail system, and that a few extra inmates each month added a huge taxpayer expense to a small institution. Another study, an academic study published in 2002, reviewed 301 quantitative analyses in order to determine the economic implications of mining for non-metropolitan regions. It concluded that unemployment and poverty worsened in mining counties in non-metropolitan regions. It found that the highest levels of long-term poverty are in places where there was once a thriving extractive industry. Another study that I referred to earlier is being done by Dr. Susan Christofferson at Cornell. Her research is not funded by the gas industry. It's funded by the Heinz Foundation and the Park Foundation. She says that the gas industry is a speculative, high-risk, short-term industry, and that the shale play is likely to create a short-term boom followed by a long-term bust. Note that not only economists and environmental activists are saying this about the economic impact, even investment analysts are saying that the oil and gas business has a record of booms and busts. Economic development experts all know that this is not desirable for a community. We also all know that some gas companies and some landowners would be very happy to just have a short-term boom in order to take the money and run, treating our region as a bunch of throwaway communities. Nobody disagrees that there will be short-term jobs. The jobs created will be on drilling sites and some ancillary jobs such as truck drivers, welders, road workers, hotel and restaurant workers. The questions are, how many are long-term, full-time jobs? How many are good jobs? How many of these jobs will be filled by local residents? How long will these jobs last? If our legislators and other decision makers are truly concerned about our health, our environment, and our community's long-term economic condition, they should pay attention to the conclusions of independent researchers based on sound methodology and data, and not researchers hired by the gas companies, and certainly not to selected anecdotal clips of anticipated jobs cited by representatives of the gas industry. Again, independent, unbiased research indicates that there will be a long-term bust, and we may very well end up worse off than we are now. The only parties likely to benefit in the long run are the gas companies and a few lucky landowners. Here are some of my conclusions. The economic impact studies that conclude a positive economic impact ignore important and significant costs. The economic impact studies that show positive benefits have been funded primarily by the industry. The methodology used is often inappropriate for a thorough evaluation of this industry in this region. The economic impact may not be worth the risk of the potentially severe and, in some cases, irreversible consequences in the form of health, environmental, and infrastructure degradation. Gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale is likely to result in a short-term boom followed by a long-term bust. Beware, gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale may well result in a negative economic impact for New York. And before I close, I want to let you all know that I feel very strongly that New York State should not allow gas drilling unless and until proper planning, policies, and regulations are in place. And we're very far away here in New York from having proper planning, policies, or regulations for this. We don't have enough solid, respectable research on environmental, public health, or economic benefits. And until we do, New York State should ban gas drilling. If and when such research is done, and if we can be satisfied that there is a safe way to extract this resource, then we would first need to develop a long-term economic development plan in order to reduce the negative effects of a long-term bust. We would need a tax policy in place that taxes the industry and others making money off of our gas resources, and we need to tax production at high rates from the very beginning of production, while production is at its highest. Much of the tax revenue must be used to protect our communities that are impacted. We can't have it just sent to the general fund. We must have accurate monitoring in place at well sites to be sure that we have accurate production numbers. We can't rely on an honor system of the gas companies to self-report their production. We must wait for the EPA study, and we must have proper environmental regulations in place at the state level. We must also be aware that communities with the actual wells are not the only communities that will be impacted in a negative way. Nearby communities without gas wells will have related industrial development. They'll also have costs associated with, many costs associated with heavy industrial activity, and also the long-term bust. Pipelines are often not mentioned in these talks that I go to, but pipelines are a big issue for economic development as well. We're talking about a very big, vast network of pipelines, from gathering lines, collection lines, transmission lines, a spider web of lines all over the place. It has been pointed out both in Texas and in Bradford County, Pennsylvania, that the potential of future development is severely limited if we have all of these pipelines running all over the place, because you can't build on top of any of these pipelines or near any of these pipelines. So it could, if you wanted to do a housing development or any other kind of development in the future, you can't. And one fact that many people don't realize is that small towns are much more exposed to the economic risk than our larger communities. They have smaller budgets, smaller taxpayer base, less diversity. And every new study that seems to come out lately has more bad news about the negative environmental impacts of gas drilling, including the recent Cornell study and the more recent Duke University study. We're lucky in New York that we have an opportunity to wait and watch what happens in our neighboring state of Pennsylvania over the longer term before we take any risks. The gas is not going to go anywhere while we wait, watch, do the thorough research, and figure out how to extract the resource safely and in a way that would benefit and protect everybody in the region. Please email me.
Dr. Barth, you did a wonderful job of condensing what I heard much longer presentation into very briefly. We have about 5 minutes for questions. Please raise your hand. I'll try to identify you as best I can. If you've already spoken, please leave time for someone who hasn't spoken, and be brief and to the point. Yeah.
One thing, thank you very much. One comment, one question. I would have liked to have heard a little more about the cost of cleanup, if it was even possible. And the other thing is, as you may be aware, New York State Pension Fund is heavily invested in the oil and gas industry. How can we get out of it so that our legislatures, our government in New York State is actually can listen because they're not involved economically? Thanks.
I think that's horrendous that they've invested so heavily into the pension fund has invested so heavily into the oil and gas industry. And when I heard that, I started calling all of my friends who, have, teach in New York State and have all these, so they're writing, my friends are writing, tell all your friends who have that pension to write. I mean, I don't know what you can do to fix that, but I think it's just horrible because obviously they're biased. And cost of cleanup is a really important question. And I don't have the answers, and the problem is we don't really know the extent of what has to be cleaned up. So it's kind of impossible to actually get a good firm estimate on it. But I mean, again, sorry, Pennsylvania, but we should go to our neighboring state of Pennsylvania and see what it costs them when they have each spill and figure out the risks. And somebody should do that. It's a big effort to try to figure that out, though.
Yes, Chris.
On the same line, Tom DiNapoli was actually just here speaking to our county Democratic committee this past week, and I did ask him that question, and everybody clapped, and he squirmed a whole heck of a lot, made some poor excuses.
It's helping his pension.
Yep. But my question for you is, I'm a real biomass proponent, and I noticed of all of your renewables, biomass has the highest job creation potential. I'm really concerned about pipelines and forestry. Have any studies been done? Because, of course, these are both natural resources. You look at a county like Tioga County, New York. Actually, currently, its forestry is one of its biggest economic drivers. Do you know about anybody doing any work on are we eliminating our ability to cash in on the natural resource of the woods when we put all these pipelines through and then the equipment can't go over them and so on?
Yeah, I'm sure we are, and I really complain a lot because I don't hear enough people talking about pipelines and the potential negative impact of pipelines. I mean, I just mentioned the economic development aspect of it. I'm no scientist or engineer, so I don't really know much about the risks of them, but clearly there must be other risks associated with pipelines that just get shoved under the table. So I would encourage you asking some engineers that you know to start doing that type of research. Regarding the forestry relation, I'll put my daughter on it because she's about to start a forestry grad school in September, so she'll be back to you.
There's a question in the back. Yeah? What's that? Michael?
Well, could you go into some more detail on the effect on agriculture? For example, like an individual farm that has a well on it, how does that affect those farms' agricultural production?
Yeah, I'm not a farmer and I don't know much about agriculture, but there was a webinar just last week that I listened to. Did anybody else hear that? They were talking about the impact on farms, and they were talking about soil compaction and all these things that I don't really know anything about. But if you want to give me your email, I'll send you a link to that webinar, and there's a lot of information on that webinar. So afterwards.
Yes.
So on the radio 2 days ago, there was a report on endangered river systems in the United States. You think the Mississippi and different things. They said the Susquehanna, because of Marcellus shale, if it goes in, it's a number one endangered. Should that go into effect? That to the side. On the information, one would take a reasonable, rational approach. As you've laid the groundwork, and if all those things are in place, people will probably make decisions based on that, but the impact is not ameliorated. The impact of trucks and traffic and industrial landscape, before, during, and after the extraction is going to be horrendous. So, that's where, again, with local communities and people who care about their environment and their home, it's what they do that, to try to avoid, the higher you go, the more money has an influence, and they don't really care what happens, in someone else's backyard. So, that's, I think, where most people are coming from on a local basis is, we live here and, we feel for the people in Pennsylvania where this is happening and the bad impact on them. And hopefully, that can be corrected, and hopefully it can be stopped from, coming, here where we have some say on things.
Well, I certainly hope so, and it just made me think of something that people have made a big deal about trying to make sure that there's a cumulative impact study done for environmental impacts. But equally, it has to be done for the economic impacts, because there are many cumulative economic impacts. You can't just look at the impact from one well and then multiply it. It could be explosive, basically, no pun intended. But I think that we have to really ask people to do that as well, because the impact on our economies, especially our local economies in the long run, really could be devastating, and I don't think people understand that.